Ready? Yeah. Good. Okay, welcome to our fruit tree spring pruning and care class. So we're gonna probably dive mostly into pruning a little bit, but then we're also gonna go into some basic care for disease or insect control that you might be having issues with. And then hopefully we'll kind of go into some more specifics on some of the more generic kind of fruit tree categories that you might, and some specifics on those. So to introduce myself, I'm Todd Schwieder. I am their diagnostic and pretty much their diagnostic manager. I sit here on this desk just behind this wall here, me and my team, and our job is literally just to help people with their plant problems. So you're always welcome. Pull up a chair, relax, tell me all your plant woes, and we'll see if we can get through them with you. We are, just to kind of, I'll do a little quick preface. I got my degree from BYU, Idaho, and they have, in horticulture, I should clarify, and they have a really fairly large and one of the older apple tree orchards on the west in BYU, Idaho. So I know apple trees actually pretty well. Now, I've always grown up in Idaho, and before I moved to Utah, I lived in Sun Valley, if you know where that is. So it's higher up elevation, which you can do some of these other kind of fruit trees, like plums are really good and things like that. However, they're moving to Utah, that has opened up the options as far as fruit trees. So I definitely don't know, like I studied all the fruit trees, but when it comes to some of these other varieties, I may not know the details as well as I know on apple trees, but I'll give you a good start. Here, we have 3 people. Let's grab this chair right here. We'll kind of put it over here. I also have a chair right here we can kind of slide in. And then can I steal that chair right there? Oops, sorry. We'll try to get more people in here. Hopefully that's okay. Like I said, we're trying a new way this way. We'll see. Sometimes we try to put information on Facebook to see how many people are coming, but then we're always surprised sometimes with how many people show up. So, so that is just a little bit about my background, just so you kind of know my expertise, I guess. But yeah, and we're going to be mostly talking about fruit trees, not much on raspberries or those kind of things. If you have questions about them, by all means, come and chat with me afterwards, and we can go into more of the shrubs of the fruit varieties, the fruit shrubs. But we're going to mostly be talking about trees. So first of all, just so I kind of have an idea of who I'm, like the skill level, I guess I'm talking with, who has fruit trees on their property? Okay, who has more than one fruit tree on their property? Okay, who feels fairly seasoned as a fruit tree grower? Okay, and who feels like I just planted them last year and I don't know what I'm doing, kind of thing? Okay, awesome. Okay, just kind of getting a feel for what audience I'm speaking with. So we're going to go over the basics, like I said, and then hopefully we can get in some details. So first of all, pruning. Why should you prune? Okay, there's 2 reasons why you prune. One is to prune just to make the tree look good. Okay, and that's usually pruning for your more ornamental varieties. And you're not necessarily pruning for fruit. Okay, the other reason why you prune is to maximize your fruit production and make it easier to pick that fruit by keeping it smaller. Now, what I like to tell people is you can be you can make gardening as simple to as complex as you want, okay? So you could just take like this apple tree, plant it in the ground and not touch it again, okay? And it will probably still produce fruit, okay? As long as you're taking care of it and keeping it alive, like doing those basic plant care. But if you didn't prune it, you didn't do anything with it, you just kept it alive and watered it, put it in your yard, it will produce fruit eventually, okay? And it'll probably do a few years of really good crops, okay? But then because you're not pruning it, it'll start maybe not producing as well or as consistently, or you might start getting disease, you might start getting some coddling moth in the apple tree, things like that. So, but if you're like, I want fruit trees, I like the idea of fruit trees, but I don't really want to like be too crazy, you can go to that extreme and it will still probably produce fruit, okay? Now, you could go to the other extreme where you are pruning it every year, every month, and you're just having this perfect like example of a tree, and you could go that extreme as well, and you'd probably get more of a crop, you'd probably get more of more fruit, a larger fruit. Hopefully you're spraying it, so you're getting less bugs in your fruit. So you can go to either extreme. And also sometimes people like the idea of fruit trees, but they put it in a spot where it's part of their landscape. Okay. And if you're pruning a tree for the purpose of fruit, they usually don't look good. Okay. They look funky usually because you're pruning it for a different purpose. And so sometimes people will like, I really want a nice flowering apple tree, but it's in the middle of my yard where everyone can see it. So I still want to prune it to make it look good. So you still, instead of pruning it for fruit, you may prune it for aesthetics. And you'll probably still get fruit off of it. But because you're pruning it more for aesthetics, you're not going to maybe get as big of a crop. Does that make sense? So you can, fruit trees are usually pretty forgiving and they will still produce even if you don't do anything. Okay. So that's just something to kind of just get out there, that there's different ways to do it. There's not like you have to do it this way to get fruit. Trees are pretty forgiving. Okay. Now, but if in this class we're going to be talking, the principles for pruning for it to look nice will also apply to how to prune it for shape or for fruit production. A lot of the same pruning principles apply. It's just maybe a different approach, and you might cut different branches depending on how you do it. So the other, and like I said, when you're pruning for fruit production, you're pruning it in a way that usually keeps it smaller so you can easily pick it, so you're not like getting on a 10-foot ladder and putting your life at risk trying to get those apples in the top, or it's too big and so you only pick the bottom ones, and then the top ones attract all the coddling moth or the different bugs that you're always dealing with, and you're making a feast for them, and then you're always dealing with an issue because you don't pick all of the fruit on your plant, kind of thing. So so pruning to keep it in shape, and then also pruning to promote fruit production. So that's what we're going to be mostly talking about today. When should you prune? Late winter to early spring is usually the time you want to do it. Most of the fruit trees that we have, in fact, I want to say all of the fruit trees that we have in Utah are deciduous. We don't have like things like citrus and things like that that grow in our climate. So everything that we grow in Utah is deciduous. So they do need a cold season to produce. So apples, for example, that's why you don't really have apples in California, is usually they have too warm of a winter. And so they don't have that cold season that allows them to do their normal cycle in order to produce well. And so that's why they're more in like Oregon, Washington, where all the apple trees, where it's a little colder, but not necessarily as cold as Utah. But apples do well in cold climates because they need that cold season. But so do cherries, so do so do peaches to a degree, so do other kind of fruit. So So that cold season is needed. So if you're trying to do a bonsai, don't do it inside. You need that apple tree outside if you want a bonsai apple tree to produce. So usually you want to prune when it's dormant, because they go dormant. That's when they're not actively growing. They're not going to have as much shock value. And so therefore you want to prune it when there's less shock. There are some exceptions to that rule. Plums potentially being one of those exceptions, where they often recommend in more, especially in more humid climates. We're pretty dry here, so it's not as imperative to do it, but there are some diseases that plums can get. And so sometimes they recommend pruning plums more in the summer, when they're after they flower out, so you don't get some diseases that they can be get if you prune them during the winter. But in Utah, because we're more of a drier climate, we don't have as many issues here. You're probably fine pruning them in the winter time. But if you seem to be having problems, maybe that's a solution to kind of mitigate against that. But in general, I would say even in plums in general in Utah, just prune them in the spring, in the early spring or winter, before they start sending out flowers or buds, and things like that. So right now is a great time to prune. Hence, that's why we're doing the class right now. Okay, so, to encourage that. So right now is a great time to prune. We also have, and then you can prune later in the year, but usually when you're pruning, after you do your initial prune in the winter, spring, you can do later pruning, but that pruning is usually more for bud pruning, like controlling the buds so that you don't have too many fruit. So if any of you have had an apricot tree, you've probably had this problem where you get hundreds of thousands of apricots, but pretty much they're just pit. They have like no flesh on them. Okay, and that one potential reason why that is because you have so many fruit on it that the tree is trying to divide its energy into multiple flowers. And so instead of getting some nice apricots or peaches do this as well, instead you just get like this dinky little thing with hardly any flesh on it. And so then you're just pretty much eating the flesh really quick, and then you're just sucking on a pit. So so thinning out the buds can help with that. And we'll get into details hopefully as we go along. And just to make sure everyone is comfortable, if you have questions or if something comes in, please raise your hand and I'll totally be willing to answer.
My fruit trees are already sending out the buds. Is that too late now to prune them? Or?
Well, are they tight? Are they already starting to open, or are they tight?
No, they're still...
Then you're probably fine. Yeah, it's more of like these trees just came in. I forget from where, but because they came in from another location, not in Utah, they're already starting to flower. And then maybe I would be a little like, I would probably still be fine pruning something like this if I was late getting to it and it was already kind of doing something like this. But ideally, you would want to prune it more when it's kind of more in this stage where the buds are really tight. It's still very dormant. It's not actively trying to do something. If the bud, like these buds are starting to kind of swell a little bit on them, especially on these top ones. So there can be a little bit of like, there's kind of a window there. So ideally, but if this was what my tree looked like, I would probably still be fine pruning it. Okay. It's still fairly dormant, but it is starting to wake up. So when a tree is more awake and you start pruning, the risk of stressing the plant out goes up. So there's less risk when pruning when the plant is dormant, but when the plant is awake and you start pruning, then there's the risk of maybe stressing the plant out gets higher. And then if you prune excessively, like you have a really old tree and you really cut it down a lot, then potentially you're going to be putting even more stress on it because you're cutting out a lot. So if you're going to be cutting out a lot, you want to do it when it's more dormant to try to balance out that stress that's going on the tree. So things to kind of balance as you go. So yeah, So that's kind of the reason. When should you prune and why should you prune? And then let's kind of go into the general pruning guidelines. I do have it on this form here, just to try to say, if you don't want to take notes, hopefully it's here. Normally, when you first start to prune a tree, whether it's for ornamental or for fruit production, you kind of want to go down this list. First of all, you want to get rid of the dead or damaged branches, okay? Because if they're dead, they're not doing anything for the tree. You can cut those out. Just get rid of them. And anything that's damaged, broken, you can also try to get rid of that as well. Sometimes during the winter, you might get some broken branches or weight from the snow if we have a really heavy year. Things like that, deer damage. Sometimes if you have broken limbs, if you live where deer are, you can just remove anything that's damaged. After you do that, you want to remove things that are diseased, okay? Fruit trees, often the terminology is gummosis or canker, okay? If you know of a history of the plant having disease, you want to try to remove the diseased branches out as well. And if you're familiar with, when we get into the details, we'll maybe try to go more into this depending on time, but that's like fire blight is a disease that that apples and pears, sometimes cherries can get, and it can be, I think cherries can get it, or maybe I'm confusing it, but I know apples and pears can get it, and things like that. Did you have a question? That might be an insect problem versus a disease problem, because that might be your peach tree twig borer, possibly. I'd have to see photos of it, but disease, like, I'm thinking more disease than insect. But if it's dead, definitely cut it out. If it's gone all black and dead and died back last year, cut it out. But if you have live tissue, but it's sometimes disease will show in the form of like a bruise where it's kind of soft, and or you'll see some like gumming on it. Now, there is sometimes, if we have a wet spring and the tree starts to wake up, it may send out sap, which is natural and not gummosis, not a disease. So usually disease, if you just see sapping, but you don't see a bruise to it, then maybe it's just normal sapping, especially if it's in the crotch of the branches where the gummosis, like it just has so much liquid in it because of the wet spring that that liquid has to go somewhere. And so it kind of forces out. I would say apple trees, I don't see that as much on, but on like peach trees, I'll see some natural gumming sometimes. Where apple trees, I don't normally see that, but sometimes I have seen that happen where people think it's diseased, but it's not. One way to kind of test for diseases when you're trying to determine if a branch is diseased, if you see gummosis, you can take a knife and you can kind of scratch away the where that disease is and look at the wood underneath it. If it looks black or gray or not a natural color, then that's a good chance it's a disease. But if you scratch that away and it's just sap, but the wood underneath it looks healthy, then you're probably just normal. It's just natural sapping from a wet spring. But but if you are removing disease, if you are familiar of past disease, or you see potential disease when you're pruning, make sure you clean your pruners in between, because pruners, when you cut through a diseased branch or something, often the disease is either fungal, bacterial, and sometimes viral. And when you cut through it, those spores or fungi or bacterium or viruses get on your pruners, and then you go and prune somewhere else or another tree, and you can spread that disease. So if you are aware of a disease problem that you're dealing with and you're pruning to try to get it out or to kind of control, like for your tree, make sure you have a bucket of bleach or something like that, where you can dip it in, wipe it down between cuts. And literally you want to do it between every cut, because it only takes one time of forgetting to clean your pruners, and all of a sudden you have spread that disease to a new location, and it's you, and then the disease is more entrenched in your plant. So yes.
We want full bleach, not not diluted.
Well, like I would say you're probably fine diluting it. Like you just want to make sure it kills. So bleach comes in like different companies have bleach things.
I do like a
10 to 1.
solution.
Yeah. So 10 to 1, but you don't just have to, you can use other things other than bleach. That's just probably the most common one to use, but you're just trying to make sure it's a strong enough solution that it kills 99.99999% of your, like, of all the advertisements. This kills 99.99999. Like you just want to kill as much of that disease that's on those pruners or saws or anything that you're cutting with. Okay, loppers, saws, pruners, whatever, chainsaws. You may, like, like if you're doing bigger branches, you may need to clean the chainsaw in between. That one's a little harder because it's more of a engine. You don't want to like mess up the engine, but the blade you want to clean. So whatever you're cleaning with, pruning with, you want to clean that. Okay. After you kind of get rid of the dead and the diseased, you want to move to the water sprouts and suckers. So suckers are what come out from the bottom, usually is what we call a sucker. Fruit trees, they just sucker. You're gonna deal with suckers, especially on things like apples and pears and plums, even and almost all fruit trees usually sucker to some degree. Cut those out to get rid of them. I do have a product here. Where is it? Sucker Punch. If you keep dealing with a lot of sucker problems and you're just annoyed with the suckers at the base of the tree, and this is for any kind of tree, this is pretty much a root hormone. So it's not a chemical. It is a chemical because it's root hormone, but it's not like it's not like a insecticide or a herbicide. It's a root hormone, and pretty much after you cut a limb, you spray where you cut, and it tells the plant that, hey, instead of the cells turning into a new bud or a new stem, it puts this root hormone on it saying, hey, you want to stay a root. And so it kind of, it minimizes the potential of that cut, because anytime you cut a limb or a sucker or anything, it's going to have that potential to send out new growth. Okay. So we want to try to eliminate that. That is potentially a solution to try.
That work on roses?
Yeah, it'll work on roses as well. If you're having a lot, like I don't think to use it on roses, but I don't know why it wouldn't, because it's just a root hormone essentially. But that could potentially be a solution to keep suckers at bay if it does become a problem. Normally I just have 1 or 2 suckers and it keeps it going. And no, I probably wouldn't use. I don't think so, because roots, the reason why on the base it kind of works is because it's kind of close to the soil. Because sometimes, like if you have like a sucker that's growing out of a weird part of your yard from like an aspen tree, but you don't want to kill the main tree, so you're trying to not kill that root system. Sometimes you can spray it and then cover it with soil, and then the dark area as well as the root hormone encourage it to just stay a root instead of sending up suckers. So I've never tried it. I would have to maybe read the label. I don't ever usually think of it using it on branches. I just use it for suckers. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's going to be a little different. That's going to be more pruning practices than, but if you have a lot of suckers at the base, then that could be a really good product to try. As far as what a sprout is, do I have any good samples of sprouts here on some of these trees that just came in? Not really. So I see a lot of sprouts mostly on peach trees and nectarine trees. And what you'll see is all of a sudden, I'll see them on apple trees as well, but all of a sudden you'll see like you'll have a nice branch, and all of a sudden that year it just sends up this really straight branch, and it just goes straight up. And it's just this really long arch, and that is a sucker, or not a sucker, a sprout. Okay, and those where if it seems to be growing normally and it's sending out branches, then that's a normal branch. Where a sprout is where you have like a main trunk or a main branch, and it seems to be doing good, and all of a sudden that tree just decided to send up straight to heaven, this branch going straight up. That is a sprout, and normally you don't want those. Sometimes you might say, hey, actually, I kind of like where that is. Maybe you'll incorporate it into your pruning to maximize your fruit production. But in most cases, you don't want those, in a lot of cases. So usually you want to cut those out. And then you're looking for cross or rubbing branches. So this just came in from the grower themselves. As you can see, they've trained it to be, so all the branches are kind of going opposite of each other to a degree, and things. So there's no branches crossing, rubbing, or anything kind of like that. Oh, yep, we do have one right there that's kind of going crazy, but maybe that's just kind of got tucked in there, possibly. So maybe if we kind of pull it out, it will be okay. Looks like sometimes when they get smashed in a truck because they get delivered, branches get pushed up. So you're trying to keep away from those crossing or rubbing branches. You also, if you have branches kind of in that same category, I would say branches growing down. So if you have any branches, suckers, or branches that kind of go straight down and kind of swoop up, usually I like to get rid of those because I don't want to mow under those. I don't want to try to duck underneath those arching down branches. So as it grows, I'll cut those out as well. And then you kind of want to look for branches that have weak crotch angles. So normally, which according to this is less than a 60-degree angle. So we in general, that's kind of maybe almost a 90-degree right there. So that's a good angle. That's a good angle. So again, the growers that we bought this from they've been training it well, trying to keep those angles from being too tight. Like possibly some down, like this one was kind of pushed up and damaged. So I don't know, maybe it was a little further down, but maybe that one's maybe a little tighter than what we would want, kind of thing. I don't know if you can kind of see that over there, but it's at the same time, it's not a bad angle. It's not like right up going straight up along the side. See if we have any others here. Like these are all new product that just came in, so it's probably not too bad of an option here. But like that's maybe a little bit of a tighter angle right there. And maybe I would consider saying, oh, maybe I need to do something about that. Do you have to do it all the time? No. But sometimes that's good to keep in mind, those really tight angles, that usually the tighter it is, the more weaker that joint's going to be. So tight angles, the reason why they're weak is you kind of have the bark on both sides of these are kind of growing into each other. And as those grow into each other, it kind of creates this bunching up of bark and tissue, if you will, and things like that. And then that just makes it a weaker angle. And so if it was a really tight angle and it was really bunched up and snow or something caught it, that is going to break easier than something that is going to be more at a 90-degree or less than a 60-degree. It won't break as much. So those wider angles are going to be stronger and more resilient to potential snowfall and things like that.
So on your diagram, you have one that's is that the one where it's going down and you don't
Yes.
cut that one off?
Yep. things that are kind of going down or towards the center of the trunk, yeah, you want to kind of get rid of those hangers. You can kind of, what she's talking about is this little picture here. You have that branch that's growing down. That's a hanger. That's so often they'll grow down, and then once they get out of the shadow of the upper branches, then they'll start to kind of grow up, and so they're kind of annoying. So I like to cut those hangers or drooping down kind of branches. That is the basics. Any questions about the basics of pruning? Yes, sir.
On the sprouts
Uh-huh.
up on the top of the tree, where do you cut those off? Right down in the crotch or up a little ways?
So it kind of depends on which we're going to kind of get into next. Well, I'm going to talk about pruning cuts here, like the best way to cut, but then I'm going to get into on the back of your paper here where it talks about how, like, different ways to prune, like different ways to build the structure of your plant. And it kind of depends on what structure and what kind of plant you're dealing with. Because some plants you want more natural, some plants you want more in a V shape. And so kind of depending on the plant, maybe you would determine the best way to prune it. And then it's like, the other question is like, do I want it to keep growing? Do I want it to get bigger? If you're wanting to get bigger, then maybe you would prune those sprouts at a few buds so that it encourages more growth. But if you're like, no, it's at the max I want to grow, then maybe I would be more aggressive in pruning those back. Okay, so it kind of depends on what your end goal is and what kind of tree it is. So, and then hopefully we'll get more into some of those details, and maybe that'll make more clear on that as we get more into the specifics of different kind of plants. Do we have another question over here?
So this front image is
Uh-huh.
what we call the modified under.
So maybe I think this picture is more designed just to try to showcase all the different potential things you're going to deal with. So it's more of, they just showed that, saying that that's the terminology for a top cut like that is called topping. And so I wouldn't use that as an example necessarily as a modified leader, but we'll get into topping here in a second. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So we're going to skip the type of pruning cuts here. That might answer your question on the top branches, on the suckers on the top. Head cutting versus thinning at cut. Removing an entire branch or shoot back to its lateral branch versus shortening a branch or shoot to encourage lateral growth. So those top branches, that type of pruning on page 1, that may kind of answer your question as well. It kind of depends on what you're trying to go for, whether you want new branching or if you want to try to eliminate it. About those top branches that kind of grow up. So pruning cuts, we want to, for the health of the tree, we want to make sure we cut it correctly, because especially on like peach trees, and most stone fruit, peach trees, cherries, nectarines, can get an insect called, there's some borers that can attack those. There's the greater peach tree borer that attacks at the base, but then there's also the peach tree twig borer. They usually go more through the twig, like the twigs or the buds. But sometimes when you have poor cuts, it makes an opportunity for insects to attack it. Okay, so, and we want to try to eliminate those poor cuts to keep the tree as healthy as possible, to minimize the attractant of opportunistic insects that are going to try to take advantage of getting inside the tree if you do a poor cut. And this is whether you're doing fruit trees or normal tree or normal ornamental cutting. We want to try to eliminate some of those things. So we kind of have a little diagram here. This is from USU, I believe. Both of these pictures, I think, from USU. But they have this little diagram that kind of shows you the best way to prune it. And I will kind of go over the basics of just how I think of it. So pretty much on a plant, we'll go into some plant anatomy. We have right here, I don't know if you can see, but there's a bud back here on this backside right here. There's a bud cluster right here as well. So these are the buds. And then in between the buds is what we call the internode. Okay. And the internode is the woody part. Now, the bud is where the energy is going into the plant, not into the internode. The internode is just the transfer of energy through the stem to get to these other buds along that way. So if I go and cut in between the internode, what's going to happen is it's going to die back at least to that first bud. Okay. And if for some reason gets diseased or damaged or something like that, maybe it'll die back further. Or if it's stressed out, maybe it won't stop at that bud and maybe it'll die back further. Okay. So you never want to cut in between an internode. And that pretty much, so cutting too high on the bud is that first one. You're cutting in that internode kind of idea. So we don't want to cut in there. So, and then if the other rule, the next one is saying cutting at the wrong angle. So normally you want to cut at the same angle that you have that bud. So I don't know if you can see that. This is a bigger bud on the end. Let me kind of rotate this so you can see it better. I don't know if you can see that bud right there on that end there. It is going this way. So when I go to cut, not in the internode, but I want to kind of cut right above that bud, I want to cut at the same angle of that bud to make sure that there's no, because by cutting the other way, I'm going to have some of that internode still showing, okay? Even though it's not necessarily a straight cut through the internode, some of that internode is still there. And we don't want any internode cutting in between that bud. So we want to get rid of, we want to make sure we cut it at the right angle. The next one is cutting too close to the bud. So like I said earlier, the bud is where the energy, where the plant is putting energy to do either grow a new leaf, to grow a new stem, or to grow a flower. And if you cut too far into that bud, you are potentially harming that area. So often you will see kind of a bulge. You will kind of see kind of like a bulgy area where the bud is coming out. You don't want to cut into that bulge area. You want to make sure you're high enough up that you're bypassing that bulge where the bud is, but you're not going so high that you're getting into the internode, okay? Or else it'll die back, okay? So you're trying to find that balance there. The next one is angle too steep. Again, because you're cutting too steep, you are leaving some of that internode there, which then dies back, creating an opportunity for insects to get in. Okay. And then a rough cut, anything, it's kind of like your own skin. If you have a nice clean cut with a nice clean knife when you're cooking, that's going to heal up better versus a dull knife where if you cut your finger with a dull knife, it tears up that skin more, making it harder for the plant to recover or for your skin to heal. That's the same thing with plants. So when you cut, you want to make sure you have nice clean pruners and nice sharp pruners so that you have a nice clean cut, allowing the tree to heal more efficiently and better. Yes. Yes. Well, so first of all, like I do have your own pruning sharpeners here. These are going to be kind of like if you have a steel, where like in your kitchen knife counter, where if you are good at using your steel and you just kind of slowly get the burrs off of the edges and you just do that consistently, you're going to probably keep a sharp enough blade for a pruner longer. Now, if you're like me, who's lazy, and I don't do this every time I use my pruner, then the burrs on the pruners can start building up, and then it starts getting weaker, and then you're going to have to actually do an actual sharpening session where either you get like professional sharpening tools or you take it to someone to get it sharpened, and things like that. Yard Butler is a really good company. We had them come last year. I don't know if the plan is this year or not, but you can pay them to sharpen your tools and things like that. But if you are good at every time you prune, after every pruning session, you go and you just kind of do that at the right angle. You have to make sure you're at that 45 or whatever it is. It's not 45. Is it 45? But you want, like, you kind of go in and you just kind of clean up those edges. You're probably going to keep a sharp enough edge to do fine. Also, the other thing with pruners is keeping them oiled. So at the end of the year, you don't have to necessarily do this every year, every time after pruning, unless you're pruning all the time. But at least at the end of the year, when you're putting your tools away for the winter, it's probably a good idea to get some oil to kind of just keep them from getting rusted during the winter, or when they're just sitting there and things like that. So if you do those, you're probably going to keep a sharp enough blade that you're just fine. But if you don't do that, then eventually you may have to do a more of an intense sharpening on those tools. And then lastly, we have the correct cut, where it's not too deep, it's not too high, it's at the right angle with the bud, and that is going to heal the fastest with the minimal risk, with minimizing that risk of disease or insects getting into that new cut. So those are kind of some ideas. Like, hopefully that makes more sense, so that you're not just like, oh, I don't know. Like, sometimes these pictures are great, but you don't know the reason. Hopefully now you know the reason. And hopefully that'll help make you more understanding why we need to do a correct cut. Any questions on that before we move on to the next section? Yes?
What oil do you use for the
WD-40 or
no, that's more, no.
when it doesn't move?
Yeah, that's where, like, WD-40 is more for the joints and things like that. I think you usually,
I
be
use
on-
a 3-in-1.
a 3-in-1, is that? Yeah. Like, if I open up this, my guess is often there's an oil pre on these, and it's just a very thin oil. WD-40 is pretty aggressive because it's more for biting into getting rid of rust and things like that, opening up. So I don't usually like 240. Yeah, 3-in-1. Something not as harsh as 240. So, okay. Now let's kind of get into maybe some more specifics. So I'm going to start with apples because that's what I know the best. Apple trees. You can either grow them with a central leader, okay? But if you have that central leader, so right now, this is pretty much a central leader, I would call it, how it's been pruned. Yes, it has been pruned right here, and that leader has been cut, but that's more or less the production side, the company growing the tree, trying to make it branch out, get it ready to sell kind of thing. But it pretty much has a central leader that they've trained by taping it up and all that jazz. So this is pretty much, I would say, currently in a central leader stage and how it's been pruned and developed. And central leader encourages a larger tree. So if you don't mind a larger tree and you want it to get bigger and things like that than where it's currently at, you may say, hey, I'm going to continue to prune it in a way that encourages that central leader, okay? Now, when you get a tree that's starting to get bigger, you could say, hey, I'm going to do a modified leader. Pretty much what that means is I'm going to look at this tree and I'm going to cut it out right here with the correct angle. Since this is where the branch is, the angle would want to go towards that area. Again, I don't want to go into that bulbous area because that's where the new growth is kind of coming from. So I don't want, if I cut too deep into that, it might harm this. And this is going to be my modified leader. So this, one of these branches, most likely the one on the top, would turn into the new leader. But because it's not going straight up and it's more on the side, we're kind of modifying where that leader's going. But this would kind of turn into the new leader. It's just not going straight up, okay? And that's kind of your modified leader. And what that does is it kind of helps keep the plant from getting bigger, and it kind of helps it kind of grow, kind of maintain a height that you want, but still kind of keep more or less a normal tree look, okay? Both as we have on apples, pears, prunes, European plums, sweet cherries, persimmons, walnuts, jujubes, those kind of plants, they tend to grow with spurs or and I'll get into what that is here in a second, but because of how they produce their fruit, you can prune it in that fashion, whether it is a central leader or a modified leader. Okay, then we have our open or vase pruning, which is usually trees. What we have: apricot, peaches, nectarines, Asian plums, sour cherries, almond figs, and things like those kind of plants we usually want to have more open. Now, a few reasons why. One is because they normally don't really grow, they don't really have spurs. Okay, and we'll talk about spurs here, but they don't have spurs, and so they grow normally on newer wood. Okay, and so you're trying to keep it open to encourage more growth so that you get more fruit. So let's kind of go into what spurs are, because that's kind of the next thing that we need to talk about. Spurs are buds on a tree that produce year after year. So because this is an apple trees and pear trees are what most people, when they think of spurs, that's what these ones have. Now, to be honest, this has a few spurs on it that I can tell, but most of this plant does not have spurs. So these buds right here are just normal leaf or stem buds. Okay, but this possibly that one right there, where it kind of comes out and it has a little thing on the end, that one is most likely a spur. We also have some spur buds kind of down here, if you can kind of tell. See, I'm pretty sure that's a spur bud. That one's probably a spur bud as well. This may be a spur, but that might just be a new branch starting. So this tree may have a few spurs trying to develop on it, and they're called spurs because they tend to have like a little short little end out with a little flop with a bud on the end. Okay, and those will turn in, and those are usually your flowering buds. Did you have a question back here?
In other words, when we're picking the apples, sometimes the kids pick the buds with it.
Yeah. It depends on how bad they ripped it off. Did you?
I was just saying, yeah, it kind of can, like, yeah, it depends. What you would probably have to do is just go into doing a spur, like, renewal pruning.
Yeah.
Just be like a 2-year, like, pruning.
Yeah.
Regrow that spur.
Yeah, and we can kind of get into the renewal pruning here in a second, but ideally is as you're pruning, you are getting these spurs, and then these spur grows the same, send out flowers year after year. So the nice thing about apples and pears is once you get those spurs, you're going to keep that same spur, or that same area is going to grow new fruit each year, most likely. Now, as spurs, sometimes you'll get multiples as it gets older. You might get multiple spur, or like multiple buds on one spur, essentially. And sometimes you have to go and do some spur pruning, where you actually kind of limit how many buds are on there. But that is what a spur is. And with apple trees, once you get a spur and it doesn't get damaged, it will last until the tree starts to lose its energy to produce fruit. Because apple trees usually get 10, 15-ish years, I think it is. And then after that, they tend to not produce as well. Even if they do keep flowering, they're just old. So they start to not do as well with producing fruit. So that's why you can do the central and modified leader with apple trees and pear trees, is because once you get that structure, once the tree starts to grow those spurs, it will keep those spurs. And so then you can just kind of maintain the size you want and keep that same tree producing normally. So you can kind of let it get bigger, and then you can kind of maintain the size. If you want to keep it smaller, maybe you would do the modified leader sooner, so that it's not just growing up and up and up. It's more kind of going out. And then once you have those spurs, you can go and cut off all of those suckers going on the top. You can just do sucker removal, because you don't need more wood to produce those spurs because you have all the spurs you need already. So in apple trees and pear trees, if you're pruning and you get a lot of suckers, I would just cut them out essentially and keep the tree smaller and not try to let it get bigger. And then that will produce, and then once you get those spurs. Now, if you are trying to, normally an apple tree takes 3 to 5-ish years before it's mature enough to produce fruit. And part of that reasoning is because you have to promote those spurs. Okay, one is it needs to be mature enough. It needs to be strong enough and healthy enough to produce fruit. But two, young trees, most of this tree does not have spurs. Okay, it's mostly just stems and leaves and no flower buds. Okay, so you have to wait a few years, let it get bigger in order to get those spurs to grow, so then you can actually get fruit, enough flowers to pollinate and to get fruit. Okay, but sometimes if you are encouraging what Emily was talking about is you can try to encourage the tree to produce spurs. So once you have a structure, in this case, I would not want to do that with this branch because I would want this branch to probably develop into a nice branch before I encourage it to do spurs. But let's say I did want to make this branch into to encourage more spur growth. Usually what you do is you cut it down to about 4 buds. Those 4 buds will start growing. And then normally by cutting it, it causes the top buds to turn into new branches, and it will sometimes force the bottom buds to actually turn into spurs. And then once you kind of encourage spur growth, then you go in and you cut it down to the spurs. So then you don't have the branch growing, you just have the spurs. So there are ways that you can encourage a tree to do that. Normally I would first want to encourage basic structure, and then as I start getting some of those like those sprout branches, maybe I would turn those sprouts into, try to encourage them to turn them into spurs. So you can do that, but the tree will naturally develop its own spurs as it gets older. So you don't necessarily have to encourage that. Again, it's that scale of how you can be an easy gardener and just maintain general health and structure, or you can go to the other extreme and really try to maximize the growth on it. Next, any questions about apple trees, pear trees, kind of that category?
So how far up from the ground do you want your first branches?
That is totally preference, okay? Because some people have it in their backyard where they have a lawn around it and they want to get underneath it in order to mow. So maybe you would say, I'd rather have my branches higher up so I can easily get under it. Some people are like, no, I have my own designated space for my orchard and I want those lower branches so it's easier to pick so I can keep it smaller but still maximize how much growing space I want. So that's more of a preference kind of thing than it is like, oh, you have to have it at a certain height for best results. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions about pruning apple trees, pears, those kind of things? Yeah.
I had a huge harvest, and some of my branches were growing really beautifully. And I pruned them, and they were nice and structurally sound.
Uh-huh.
And the way that the apples had shaped them, so both on my pears and apples, they
Yeah.
down.
Yeah. So if you look on the first page, it talks about on when should you prune. The first one says dormancy, and then the second bullet says thin out overcrowded buds and fruit as they begin to develop. So if you see that weight, there's a few things you can do. One, you can go and go in and kind of thin how many apples you have on the tree. That is one option. Another option for apple trees and pears is possibly you can literally support them. Get some 2x4s, maybe make a Y or a notch, and maybe put some padding so you don't like damage the trunk or the wood, and you could literally support those branches as they grow. The other thing is possibly buds, like if it's an older tree and you have like right now, because this is such a young tree, these spur buds only have only has one bud on it. But sometimes you can have like 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 spur buds all together, and those are all flowering buds. And if your plant is doing that, then each of those buds may try to turn it into an apple. And one, you're going to have a lot smaller apples. Okay. And two, because you have so many apples, maybe that weight is going to be really strong. Now, also, normally when we want the burrs to the spurs to be more evenly spread and more towards not on the peripheries of the plant, because we want to encourage more growth here down in the center. And so like when you start getting those, if I get like a little water sprout kind of growing out from here, when it's younger, I'll try to train it so it turns into a spur and not turn into a spur down the road way up here. Does that make sense? To try to keep the weight more distributed throughout the tree.
Been after the king apple, but my grandkids, when they go to pick the apples, they break lots of spurs off.
Yes.
And it's heartbreaking, 'cause they're gonna thin out of these spurs.
Yeah,
I don't know which one.
obviously there's best practice, and then you have to try to find a solution with what your situation is. So you're trying to find that balance. But yeah.
So you can convert a water sprout into a spur. You cut it off at 1 bud, 2 buds. Or?
I think, come talk with me. I have a book that's a little more specific. If I remember correctly, usually you prune it down a water sprout or a branch to about, I think it's 4 or 5 buds. And then the top 3 or 4 or top of those 5 or so buds, the top ones will usually turn into new branches, but then the bottom ones may turn into fruiting buds. And then you can go and cut that all the way back just to the fruiting buds. So then you're like removing you're kind of, it's called a renewal pruning for buds. There's a kind of a system to that. So I do have a book that kind of shows it. So if you want more details, come chat with me sometime later, and we can look at that book so you can better see it visually, because I had some good pictures in it. So that is apples. Now let's move on to again, sweet cherries. Where I've lived and where I used to work, sweet cherries I was too cold for sweet cherries to grow. So I don't know sweet cherries as well, other than they're similar in that to an apple tree, where normally you just want to prune a good structure tree. And normally it'll produce its fruit by itself off of, I don't know if they're called spurs per se, but they're very similar. You can just kind of do a similar approach where you're just kind of pruning more for like just good structure. And usually the cherry tree will do fine. Let's kind of move to apricots and plums. So we're going to I know the apricots are on the open vase, but apricots and European plums are kind of similar, even though the European plums are on our central or modified. Apricots, I would dare say you can do the open vase. You can also do something more like the modified leader for apricots as well. It kind of just depends on how big of an apricot you want. I've seen apricot trees that are massive and they're really pretty. And yeah, you get some fruit off of them, but they're definitely grown more for the flower and the aesthetics than for the fruit production. Where if you're going more for fruit production, maybe you would want to do the vase to keep it shorter and tighter. But they also kind of have what we call spurs, but they're a little different than apple trees and pear trees in that their spurs only last maybe 2-3 years before you need to renew that growth. Okay. And so you can kind of just do a normal plant structure and it will probably produce its own fruit, but eventually you may need to say, I need to do some renewal growth. I need to encourage some new growth to get some new spurs, because they tend to kind of wane over a bit. So unlike apples, like once you get that spur's just going to keep going until it's kind of done or gets damaged. The pears, and that one sometimes have these shorter spurs that can help it. So you can kind of grow that way. Now, but the vasal pruning, the main purposes of doing vasal or open pruning is, one, you're trying to encourage more new growth. And so you're pruning more often to keep that vase, but you're creating more new growth because peach trees, for example, they grow off of what we call one-year wood or the redwood. So I have a pear tree here, or peach tree, I mean, sorry, getting my peas mixed up. Peach tree. Okay. So a peach tree usually grows fruit on its redwood. So you can kind of see this is red, this is red. We have a damaged branch there, so we'll prune that out. This is red. So this is all last year's growth. This is last year's growth. So if this was going to produce fruit, which probably would this year if it got planted, it would grow off of these redwood, the redwood. Now, as the wood gets older, you can see this is probably the year before, which is more green, and then this wood down here, which is even older, is more brown. This wood is less likely to produce fruit, okay? And it's usually you get your fruit off of the redwood. So what you want to do, and the company that planted this kind of topped it right here in the middle, and they're kind of creating that vase shape for you already because of the kind of tree it is. But I would say, if this was my tree that I bought, I would definitely want to continue training it to be more laterally out if possible, to kind of go more out instead of this up way. So sometimes people like to kind of get weights or pull it out to try to encourage it to be more open. Obviously, I have this branch right here kind of growing in the center. I would rather have it grow more out. But normally with peach trees, if you buy a new or a younger one, you want to try to encourage the structure, which is normally 2 or 3, maybe 4 branches coming from the base that are like, and then normally I let those kind of branch out. And then once I get that structure where I have the main trunk, the main branch with some main lateral branches, then from there, I want to encourage new growth each year. And so I want to encourage those suckers. I want to encourage the sprouts to a degree, because that is what the new growth is going to produce the fruit of the tree. So now if you have an older peach tree and it wasn't trained to do that, you're too late to train it, okay? And so then you just kind of have to try to do your best to prune it often to encourage fruit. Now, if I just let this grow, the fruit is always going to be further out, further out, further out, because it's going to keep growing on that new wood, okay? Now, so again, that spectrum, yes, I can just let it grow and I will get fruit, but eventually it's going to be further out, it's going to be harder to pick, it might be heavier, and it might bend the branches down, things like that. So normally on peaches, nectarines, apricots, sour cherries, almonds, normally I want to encourage more of this V shape. I want to keep it shorter, and I want to prune at every year. Apple trees are a little bit more forgiving. If you don't prune it every year, they'll probably still produce fruit. Maybe it won't be as good of a fruit or as big of a fruit, but but peach trees tend to be, if you're not keeping up with it, they can get out of hand a little bit quicker because you're growing off of that new growth. You're producing off of that new growth. So usually you want to prune more often with peach trees. Now, let's say you do have a good structure for your peach tree, and I want to encourage that growth. So I have the structure, I have that redwood. What do I do? Let's say this is on a good branch and I'm not pruning it. Like at this stage, I would probably want this to be one of my main branches instead of a fruit production. So I'd prune it to get it to kind of branch out and develop a good structure. But let's say this is a good structure and I want to encourage this to produce fruit. Normally with peach trees, apricots, nectarines, they produce way too much fruit. And I want to try to get rid of, I want bigger fruit instead of a lot of small fruit. So I have this sprout, we'll call it, or this branch coming out. I already have some buds kind of grow on here. I will usually go and prune it down to about half of that branch length, maybe prune it down to 6 or 7 buds kind of idea. Then that will, and so instead of growing maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 fruit, I will just grow maybe 5 fruit, okay? And then possibly, depending on how big the tree is and how much once the fruit start to develop and I actually see the little fruit developing, I will go in and hand thin out the fruit so there's only maybe 2 or 3 on this one branch instead of 20. Okay, that's going to help protect the structure so it doesn't bend and break. It's going to help get you bigger fruit so you actually have something to bite into instead of just mostly pit. Okay, and then also it's going to not put as much stress on your plant because it's not producing as many fruit. Therefore, it should hopefully be sweeter and more appetizing because the tree isn't overworking. So that is kind of some ideas. Yes.
Kind of going back to what you said before, the trees that you actually after year, how do you get back to having branches?
Yeah, so by keeping that open structure, just by pruning it, it's going to encourage new growth. So that's why you also want to prune these back, is because by pruning it, it's going to cause some of these to maybe turn into the new redwood for the following year. So once you kind of get that structure, I want to prune often. So I want to prune it. One, I don't want to prune out all the redwood because I want to because I want some fruit. But maybe if I have a weird sprout that just goes right in the middle of the tree that affects my V-shaped tree, maybe I'll just cut that one all the way out. And just the fact that you are pruning, you're going to encourage new growth. So you kind of prune back some of that redwood to produce from last year to produce the fruit. It'll still grow new redwood that same year, and then you do that same thing. So once you get that structure, you're kind of in this cycle of allowing new red growth to come up, the redwood, the new growth, and pruning it back so you get fruit, but then it sends up more. So you're just trying to get into that cycle. Yeah. Well, hopefully by doing that, you're keeping it in. Just the fact that you're pruning it every year and you're not just leaving this whole branch out here, because if I didn't prune this, it would produce fruit, but it would probably also send out new growth here. But by pruning it back, hopefully it'll send out some new growth, but I'll also get some fruit. And then I can cut this one out at the end of the year or next year and just regrow from the...
So I think she's asking if you let your tree get away from
Oh,
you.
yeah, if you let your tree get away from you, like the damage is done. There's no way to get it. The only way to get that V shape is to do it when it's young. So if it gets away from you and it's way out here, the best I can say is prune about 1/3 of the tree, keeping some of that redwood as best as possible, and see if you can slowly kind of rein it in, kind of thing. If that makes sense. Yeah, you can support it. You can, if you do have really heavy fruit, by all means, you can always support it with some like some kind of pretty much like a what is that called? A tripod or a jack or something like that, or a 2x4 with a notch in it, or something like that to help keep the branches up to support it. You can always do that. Always, if you do see your trees start to lower, obviously getting them support sooner than later, because the thing with wood, kind of going back to who had that problem with their peach trees and apple trees that are kind of growing down, wood is kind of like memory foam, where once it gets bent in a certain way and it kind of stays in that shape for a long period of time, it tends to then keep growing in that shape. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily pop back into shape. It will try, but if it gets damaged too much. The other thing with how cells work is cells in a tree are very long and skinny, and they're kind of compact together, and that's what gives them their rigidness to get support. But if it breaks or gets bent, that rigidness kind of gets loose, and then it will reheal itself, but it will reheal itself in that more loose form or in that shape as it kind of tries to tighten up. So if it does bend, you can prop it back up and then keep it there, and then hopefully it'll reheal itself more solid in the shape that you want it to be in. Okay, the last thing I was going to talk about is espalier. You can espalier trees. That is the fancy, I think it's French word for like the flat trees. You can either, in the picture, that's what we would call a candelabra espalier, or you can go straight. I've seen them on angles. I've seen them in a fan shape. There's almost all trees can be espaliered, even peach trees and nectarines and things like that. However, normally the trees that are espaliered are usually your trees that have spurs, such as apples and pears, because you can get that shape and it'll hold that shape. And because you get that spur from the same plant every time, you can create an espalier, and then you keep getting fruit. Where because a peach tree, you have to renew that renewal pruning. It's a little bit of a different process. It's pretty much doing the same thing as a vase pruning. And you get that structure, but instead of 2 or 4, you just do 2, and you make it look flat, but then you're still growing that new growth all the time. So normally, if you are interested in espaliers, normally you want to do more something like that. Okay. Any questions about pruning? I kind of try to do some details, but that's kind of the basics.
So if you want to get like your best fruit, like on the peaches now, I mean, you normally get way too many. Like, what's the rule for thinning them out? Is it like every 6 inches or?
Yeah.
Which child do you choose?
Yeah. Yeah, I would. There's a lot of different opinions, I think, out on the world. I think 6 inches sounds reasonable. Kind of finding that balance there. I think my book says about every 6 inches, if I remember correctly. I have to look at it again. I always have to remind myself when I'm like, okay, I'm going to go be pruning my peach tree. Read a few books. Just refreshing my brain. But yeah, I think 6 inches sound good. Maybe if you're like 1 year you didn't get enough fruit, maybe you could try every 5 or 4 inches and see if that's too heavy for it. You could kind of gauge it. Like,
Problems, not too few, it's too many.
yeah, usually, yeah. So I think 6 sounds good to me. But if it seems to still be too many, you could maybe go every 8 inches or something and get even less fruit on it. But kind of depends on how you prune it and stuff.
I mean, sometimes when you get a frost and they don't get very many, when you get the big knife, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, frost sometimes self-prune for you. Okay. So I did want to go quickly over, because this time of year, a lot of people hear about bare root trees. Okay, we do, here at Glover Nursery, we do not sell bare root fruit trees. We only sell them planted and established in a pot. But Costco usually has bare root and things like that. Bare root trees are great. You definitely want to do it more this time of year to get it planted. But they tend to have a higher death rate just because a lot of people don't water them properly or get the soil around them. There's air pockets in the soil. But it is totally fine to go from bare roots. We just tend to we feel like we have better success selling people an actual potted plant where it already has a root system kind of growing, so you don't have that extra barrier to get a plant started. So that's what we do here. But I just wanted to kind of mention that is a thing. and it's totally fine to do that. If you do bare root, you tend to have a larger selection because you can get online and buy bare root plants. So if you are really into you want a certain kind of fruit, but the growers that we buy from just don't grow that fruit because there's hundreds of thousands of different fruit out there. They can't grow them all. Bare root is an option to kind of get some of those specialty varieties. But if you're like, I just want a nice peach tree, you're probably going to have better results buying it in a pot than as a bare root, just because it's already has some root structure to kind of help it get going, the micro roots. The last thing I wanted to talk about was disease and pest. This time of year, the best thing I could recommend is doing something like a horticulture oil or a dormant spray. So what these are is these are both mineral oil, and what oils do is they smother disease, like any surface diseases such as powdery mildew and leaf spot, things that might, and it also helps smother any insects' eggs or insects that are wintering over on your plant. Now, the dormant oil, you want to do it when the buds are tight. This one, because this came in from a nursery, the buds are already starting to open up. I may be a little cautious to spray this. This one back here is already in flower, so it's too late to spray a dormant oil because it can potentially hinder the development of the buds and stuff. But right now, most of your trees, if you have them outside, I would assume are still pretty tight budded, and dormant oil be good. It's the same thing as a horticulture oil. It's just maybe a little thicker. This is 98.8% mineral oil, where this is just 80% mineral oil. Also, how they've been processed. The difference between, the nice thing about this one is this one you can even use when it's leafed out. So this one has more practical use all year round, where this one you can only use during the dormant season because it would burn the leaves when the leaves are out if you use it. But maybe this one's a thicker oil and will smother those eggs better than a normal horticulture oil will, just because it's a thicker oil. So you can kind of balance that out, but oils are a really good thing to try to kill things that are trying to winter over. Things that winter over are, like on apple trees, a really common one is codling moth. Codling moth lay their eggs in a lot of areas, but one place they like to lay eggs, let's say this is an apple tree, is they like to lay their eggs on the top branches, on the top side of the branches. Okay, and then they will hatch, and then they will, when the fruit start to come in, they will go get into the fruit, and that's where you get, and that's when you get they lay eggs, the eggs turn into bugs, the bugs get into your fruit, and that's where you get worms in your apples. So because they like to lay their eggs on the tree itself, because that's where the food source is, a dormant oil is a really good thing to kill codling moth. They will kill, they'll smother. Yeah, it's a smother. It won't kill them like a chemical, but it'll smother them. And what was your question?
You just pour it in a spray bottle.
If it's a small enough tree, you could do a spray bottle, yes. Usually trees are bigger that I would recommend at least a pump sprayer. And hopefully you are keeping your tree small enough that you can just use a pump sprayer and you don't have to get a hose end and things like that. Because you'll usually have better control of the dosage, if you will, in a pump sprayer to make sure you're getting right, where the hookups are really convenient, especially if you have a bigger tree. But I'm always like, pressure of your hose water might be different and maybe it's not as accurate. So that's my opinion on that. Did you have a question?
On the dormant spray, it says temperatures above 40 degrees. Is that daytime or nighttime temperatures?
I would daytime, I would say. Yeah, you just want to do it when it's not too hot. Whoopsie. Keeping kids entertained. So dormant oil is a really good one. Another one that's a really good one is a copper fungicide. This one is a hookup to a hose. I also have it in concentrates as well. as well as a form of it in a spray bottle if it's a small enough tree. This is for diseases, and this is an all-around good for almost all diseases. There are a few diseases that isn't as effective, such as fire blight, things kind of like that. But in general, this is a really good one. And because it is copper, it's not putting chemicals on your plant. So I definitely recommend this one. This one you can actually do, you could do it in the middle of January and it would be effective. Now, how it's kind of like the dormant oil. It's a good, if you know you had a disease on your plant in the past and it's more of a surface disease or something that's not, like if it's in the wood like gummosis, there's not much you can do other than cut it out. But if you had diseases or issues, this is always a good thing to do to be proactive in protecting, because most of those diseases will have something wintering over on the plant, like fungus spores or bacterium that are just waiting for the right temperature and climate and moisture to start spreading again. And what this does is it kind of kills it before it can get going. So this is a really good thing to do in the dormant season as well. Yes. The nice thing about this is that these are both oil based. So you can actually mix the two together in the same pump sprayer and spray them at the same time. So then you can kind of hit two birds with one stone instead of doing them separately. So you can do these together. Obviously, you would want just a concentrate. You wouldn't want to buy the one with the hooks. But yeah, if it's a small enough tree that you can use a pump sprayer. If it's a bigger tree because you haven't kept it smaller and you can't get a wand up high enough to spray the topper branches, then you can do this here. But like I said, both of these kill by contact or by smothering the disease or the insect. So when you spray, you want to make sure you get even coverage. If I only spray from one angle, anything on that backside isn't going to get that oil or copper on it, and that backside won't get the benefits. So when you're spraying, make sure you kind of get on top, get underneath, walk around it. Usually you want to spray to the point where it's starting to drip off the plant, but it's not like drenching the ground below you. It's not torrential draining off of the plant. You're trying to find that balance there where it gets good coverage, but it's not like soaking the ground. So, and there are other things. So those are really good things to do to take care to prevent diseases and insects. Now, especially with codling moth, the diseases that attack maybe some other kind of trees like peach trees are your borers. Those tend to, the oil may not be as effective because most of like the greater peach tree borer, they hibernate in the soil and then they come out of the soil and attack at the base of the trunk. So normally I would recommend something more like this indoor-outdoor permethrin, because you can spray the soil. Now this is not organic, this is a chemical. If you want to do something more organic, you could try spinosad or spinosad. I forget how you say it, but I always say it's spinosad. I think I'm saying it wrong, but that's if you want to go more organic, you just have to maybe spray it more often. If you have peach trees, the peach tree greater peach borer is very devastating on young peach trees because they have such a small trunk. It only takes one bug to end up girdling around the tree and killing it. So you want to, if you've had other peach trees or other stone fruit that have had that borer before, maybe just be proactive in spraying the base. Now, the greater peach tree borer only attacks the top 2-ish feet of the trunk and the soil. So you usually don't need to spray the whole tree for greater peach tree borer. You can just spray that bottom area. If you have worms in your peach tree, that is usually your peach tree twig borer. Okay, and normally if you have peach tree twig borer, they are getting into the buds, and normally you want to, that one's a little harder one because the bugs get in when they're going into flower. And obviously you don't want to spray when it's in flower because you don't want to hurt the bees. So it's kind of a weird one to try to control because that's when they get in. So you're trying to spray it before the flowers start to open, before the bees start coming out to pollinate it. But you want that kind of that chemical, something like this on there to help kill those twig borers. So if you have a history of twig borers, you may want to consider treating for that. If you haven't had twig borers or you don't have too many of your fruit with a lot of too many of your peaches with worms in it, then I would probably just not worry about spraying for that one and just keep monitoring and spraying when needed just to keep the use of chemicals down. And then the only other one that I will mention that a lot of people deal with around here, and then I need to wrap it up here, is on your cherry trees. You can get western fruit fly, and it is a really hard one to get rid of once your tree gets it. Okay, in my opinion, if you have a tree that has western fruit fly, in most cases, it's not worth trying to keep it is what it is. You're not most likely going to get rid of western fruit fly. So if you are buying a cherry tree, whether it's a sweet or a pie cherry, you have to be on top of keeping that western fruit fly out from the get-go. Because once the tree gets western fruit fly, it is very hard to get rid of it. And so when the western fruit fly get into the fruit, it's pretty much a fly. They kind of look like just a normal house fly, and they will, when the fruit on a cherry tree starts to get that salmon color, the fruit is soft enough that the bug will come in and lay their larva inside the fruit. And then that larva, as it will hatch, or the egg will hatch into a larva, and then that larva will eat inside the fruit of the cherry. And then either they will find a way out, they'll eat their way out and turn into a fly and then start the cycle over again. Or sometimes the fruit will drop on the ground if you don't harvest it. It will decompose, the bug will come out, it'll hibernate in the soil or whatever, and then it'll turn into a fly and then lay their eggs in the fruit when they get to that salmon color. So if you have that problem, or if you started noticing you're getting problems, or you have a new cherry tree that you're trying to keep from getting this problem, then you usually want to spray it when the fruit get that salmon color, because that is when the fly is actively flying around, injecting their eggs or larvae into the fruit. So normally you'd want to do something that has a residual effect, such as permethrin, and kind of kill those. And then because it has that residual effect, when they fly onto the plant, they die. I think you can spray this once a week or every 2 weeks or something like that. I have to reread the label to try it during that time frame when the fruit are starting to go salmon. Now, if you spray during that time, that can help. If you have an older tree and you really, really want to try to get it to not have the bug in it, the fruit fly larva inside your fruit, then another thing you can try to do is collect all your fruit, anything that you didn't pick. So you can put a tarp on the bottom, and then as the fruit drops, you can kind of gather those up and put them in a Ziploc bag or something that the fly can't get out of if it turns into a fly, and try to collect those. But if you have an older neighborhood where cherry trees were really popular and your neighbors aren't taking care of the western fruit fly, it's going to be hard to keep it, because then they'll just fly over and get to you from a neighbor. So western fruit fly is a really hard one unless you keep on it from the start of a new tree. So now, if you do you can still eat it. It's just extra protein. And some people like to soak their cherries in vinegar if they have and then they don't like the vinegar, so then they'll try to get away, and so they'll come out of the fruit, and then you have a fruit without. But it's kind of gross because then you see all these little maggots everywhere. But you can do that as well. So okay.
There's another solution. Don't look.
Yes, there you go. There you go. Yes.
Can you spray the ground or something under the cherry tree?
Yes, you can spray it, especially when they're dropping, but they don't just lay eggs in the soil. Like they don't just stay in the soil. They lay eggs a lot of places, and if your neighbors has it, it's just they don't just lay their eggs in one place. And so it's hard to get under control. So it's a hard one. If your plant gets it, it's a hard one to get rid of.
The neighbor doesn't do a thing.
He-
I guess I gotta give up.
So,
Spray your neighbor's tree.
okay. Thank you for coming. I hope you learned something. I do need to wrap it up. If you want to stay and talk with me later, obviously I'm only one person. I also have Emily here. I may have, I think Andrew is here. He's pretty knowledgeable as well. So we have a lot of people here that can help. I didn't get into some of the fertilizers like I was hoping to. There's just too much to cover. But so come chat with me if you need to, and I'm always here down the road if you have any other problems to help.
Just a quick question. When's the best time to fertilize your fruit?
I usually say once the tree starts to wake up.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Again, or is it